everyone. My name's Ellen Mauro, and this is my colleague and friend, Matt Kwong.
Hi, everyone.
We're here in our Washington Bureau. We'll be taking your questions on the Mueller report on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We also have some support from our colleague, Steve D'Souza, who's in our newsroom today. He's normally in New York. So please send us any questions that you might have about the findings of Robert Mueller in the report and any of the reaction to it from Republicans, from Democrats, from the president. We are yours for the next half an hour to answer any of your questions.
So maybe we can just start by talking about the lead up to this thing. We're talking about nearly 23 months of investigation. This involved more than 500 search warrants. There were 2,300 subpoenas, dozens, I think more than 30 indictments, and
13 requests to foreign governments.
Right. And this is what the report actually looks like. It's 448 pages, divided into 2 volumes. The first section goes over the criminal conspiracy count, and then there is obstruction in volume 2. So thanks to Patrick Ferguson for photocopying this for us. But we will probably be going through sort of an electronic version that's actually searchable. It makes it much easier to search for keywords.
And while we wait for some questions, we can kind of go over some of the broad strokes of what was found in the report. So as Matt said, the first volume looked at whether or not there was any conspiracy between the Trump campaign in 2016 and the Russian government. Special Counsel Mueller did not establish that there was any conspiracy, any criminal conspiracy with those two sides working together to influence the election. But he did list a number of instances where there were contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia. And while these contacts did not amount to a criminal conspiracy, Mueller did say this in the report. He says, although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the Trump campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. So despite the fact that there was no establishment of a criminal conspiracy, it's clear from Mueller's investigation that the Russians thought it would be good for them if Trump was president, and the Trump campaign was aware of some of these Russian efforts, and they thought they would be good for them as well.
Right, so if there is a case for the president here to make any case for himself being vindicated, it's probably going to be on the conspiracy bit of this, whereas on obstruction, it's a lot more ambiguous, right? So I'll just start to talk a little bit about Attorney General William Barr and how he comes into play here. Barr, we all know, released about a month ago a summary, his sort of overview of principal conclusions of what the Mueller report was going to look like. Came out about 3 weeks before we actually saw the document. And so this sort of allowed him to set the stage a bit, right? It's sort of been criticized now as being a bit of maybe spin, I think is a fair criticism. But Barr gave a press conference yesterday, right before he actually handed in this report, and sort of that gave him another chance to sort of give an oral summary.
Exactly, and Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and other Democrats were very angry at the way that happened yesterday, the fact that William Barr was having this press conference before anyone else had a chance to actually see the report. Pelosi and Schumer called it, as you know, Matt used the word spin for the letter. Pelosi and Schumer called the press conference yesterday an indefensible attempt to spin this story, and that's something that we have been hearing from Democrats over the past month, because the letter that Matt's talking about that was sent to Congress was 4 pages. If you remember the report, maybe we can show.
Right. I mean, this is double-sided too. So, but this is 448 pages with tables and appendices. Yeah. And
so Mueller handed over the report to William Barr on a Friday, and then by Sunday he had released this summary. So there has been a lot of criticism for how this is all kind of come together.
And I think one of the big takeaways from yesterday, once we actually finally got to see the report, was reactions from people just saying that they felt as if the Attorney General misrepresented maybe Robert Mueller's actual findings. Trump had claimed that he was exonerated by that letter, when in fact we know that the finding from Robert Mueller was that that this report specifically did not exonerate the president on some charges.
On the idea of obstruction
on the idea
of justice. The last line, I think it is the last line in Volume 2, which looks at obstruction, is Robert Mueller wrote that while we cannot conclude the president committed a crime, as Matt said, we also cannot exonerate him. And just to go back to some of the criticism of William Barr, in the letter that he wrote, he used part of that sentence that I read a few minutes ago. He used the part where it says, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. He didn't use the first part of that sentence, which is the part that I read a few minutes ago, where it says that both the Russians, they wanted Trump in office, they thought that would be good for them, and the Trump campaign was aware of these efforts. So that is something else that's being pointed to as perhaps not the most fulsome portrayal by William Barr of what Robert Mueller actually found.
Right. It was also pretty conspicuous in that Barr press conference that one person who wasn't present was Robert Mueller himself, actually there at this press conference to talk about his own 2-year presumably painstaking investigation, and to actually answer questions from the press about whether he felt the portrayal by Barr, either at that press conference or in that 4-page memo, whether that portrayal of his work was an accurate representation.
Exactly. And we have a question now from John Brain on Facebook, who is saying or asking, when Trump says the findings are proof that there was no collusion and no obstruction, is this an accurate portrayal of what the redacted file says? Are there a lot of questions about whether that kind of statement is even close? Well, the statement, no collusion, no obstruction, is something we've heard from the president over and over again. He also posted a video on his Twitter account yesterday, a very dramatic edited video where you hear him say the phrase, no collusion, no obstruction. It isn't an accurate statement. The investigation found there was no conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia, but it didn't look at collusion. Collusion is not a legal term. It's a term that's very easy to interpret one way or the other. Mueller makes a point in the report to actually say that it's not a term that they were looking at. So it's a curious thing to say no collusion. Also, if you think back to before we had this report, when the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, would go on TV, he would say there was no collusion, but even if there was collusion, it's not a crime. So this word collusion has really kind of muddied the waters a little bit, and it's not what Robert Mueller actually looked at. He said there was no conspiracy, but he did outline these contacts, and the question of obstruction is even less clear.
Right, and I'll just add about collusion also, just we heard in that press conference the Attorney General using the term no collusion, I think maybe 4 times, really parroting the president's rhetoric there. But as a lot of people have pointed out, that's just not how federal prosecutors speak. They don't speak in terms of collusion because it isn't a crime. They speak as Robert Mueller did in this report about conspiracy.
Which is curious to think that the top law enforcement official in the country would use a non-legal term in this all-important press conference yesterday. And we haven't really talked about why this question of no obstruction is unclear, because that's, again, not what this report says. I think we did say that the report does not exonerate him on obstruction. Instead, it points out, and Matt wrote about this on our website today, it points out several instances that were investigated for obstruction of justice.
Yeah, he actually points out, he lays out, I think it's 10 or 11 episodes of obstruction. They're all in chronological order. And I'll just read from page 214 of the report here, one of the special counsel's conclusions. He says, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not obstruct justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment. So I took that as saying, as Robert Mueller basically saying, you know, we saw that the president had maybe been doing some stuff that verged on obstruction, but that he was going to leave this call up to somebody else. Maybe there was some division within the special counsel's team about whether they would pursue that charge, but they ultimately decided not to. And one of the things we learned from this report, right, was that one of the things that the special counsel team had in mind when they decided not to pursue the charge on obstruction was a Justice Department policy from the Office of Legal Counsel that basically said you can't
indict a sitting president.
Right, right. So they clearly had that as a factor in their mind, and that's actually written in the report. And we actually have another contradiction there between what the Mueller report says and how Barr characterized the reason why Mueller decided not to pursue prosecution on obstruction. Barr actually specifically said at that press conference that he asked Mueller about that Office of Legal Counsel opinion and whether that was a factor, and that apparently it was not. But now we know from reading the report that it was very much on the minds of the special counsel when they decided not to pursue obstruction.
Exactly, and there's a few other interesting aspects on the obstruction front as well, particularly with kind of what happens now. And in that part of the report, while Robert Mueller is saying we're not going to pursue an indictment of the president, he does suggest that Congress can look into this, that this could now be in Congress's court, writing, we concluded that Congress has the authority to prohibit a president's corrupt use of his authority in order to protect the integrity of the administration of justice. So it is kind of in Congress's court now. We do know this morning that the House Judiciary Committee has issued a subpoena for the full unredacted Mueller report. I think is asking for that to be handed over by May 1st. Of course, the version that exists so far is redacted. Also, to go to one other interesting part of the obstruction element of the investigation, again, Matt was saying it lists several instances where the president tried to undermine the Russia investigation, trying to, getting Jeff Sessions, for example, the former attorney general, trying to get him to publicly denounce the investigation, at one point asking his former legal counsel, Don McGahn, to fire Robert Mueller. That did not happen. In fact, in the report, one of the people who were interviewed said that Don McGahn would say the president was asking him to do crazy, forgive the expletive, but crazy shit. So there were a lot of these instances, and then in the special counsel's kind of summation of this, he says the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out the orders that he was making. So essentially these people around President Trump, people who he would sometimes criticize like Jeff Sessions, sort of saved him in a way
from
by
himself.
himself, by not actually carrying out the orders that he was making of them.
Right. Had some of his underlings actually succeeded on some of these fronts, there would be a much stronger case for actually pursuing obstruction. Had they actually succeeded in that, but he, in a way, was foiled by his own staffers, by his own people who just felt uncomfortable with carrying out some of these directions. One of the other incidents we learned about was about Corey Lewandowski, the president's former campaign manager. In 2017, Trump asking Lewandowski to approach Jeff Sessions and to try to get Sessions to
make a speech, essentially saying that the president didn't do anything wrong. The Russia investigation was bad, very unfair.
Right.
Also, that he wanted Jeff Sessions to unrecuse himself from the Russia investigation. Now, just to kind of throw it way back, the reason Jeff Sessions recused himself in the first place was that he had what turned out to be innocuous or innocent contacts with the former Russian ambassador during the campaign. But because he had those contacts, he felt like, and it was considered a right legal decision, that he couldn't oversee the investigation. But we know that President Trump hated that because he would say that he didn't like that move from Jeff Sessions, and that was part of the investigation as well.
Yeah, so we have another question here, and I might mess up the pronunciation of your name. Sorry, Nathaniel, but it's Nathaniel Halof on YouTube. He asks, Trump wasn't exonerated. Does that mean that the Mueller report is concluding that Trump did not violate any law? So on that question, I think we went over some of that earlier when we said that there was no finding conclusively that the president
broke a law,
and colluded or was engaging in criminal conspiracy. One of the tenets of a criminal conspiracy happens to be that a formal agreement has to be made among parties. And while Ellen mentioned that there was a lot of maybe perhaps shady stuff going on with the Trump campaign, knowingly accepting some stuff that they knew that would benefit them electorally with, stolen emails from the Democratic National Committee, that even though they accepted all that, Mueller's team sort of fell short on being able to nail them on conspiracy because they weren't able to find sufficient evidence that an actual agreement had been made with the Russians.
And it's a really high bar because, as Matt was saying, the definition of conspiracy that Robert Mueller looked at was having an express or a tacit agreement to influence the election. That didn't happen, but there were these occasions. To think back to the June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower, where Donald Trump Jr. Arranged this meeting after being told that a Russian contact wanted to hand over dirt on Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government's support of his father. And then Donald Trump Jr. replies saying, well, if it's what you say, I love it. We also know from the report that he had been in contact with WikiLeaks. Think back to the 2016 campaign. WikiLeaks, according to the investigation, was getting emails, stolen Democratic emails from Russian hackers and then posting them online. And Donald Trump Jr. was talking to WikiLeaks. Candidate Trump at the time was publicly encouraging WikiLeaks. So there were these interactions, and they knew they were mutually beneficial, but it didn't reach that bar of there being this like direct or implied agreement that they were working together to influence the election. But there are some, gray areas, particularly as we were saying on the question of obstruction of justice.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit about one of the other findings that came out of this report. We learned a little bit about the president's reaction when he learned from Attorney General Jeff Sessions, his then Attorney General, that a special counsel had been appointed. And I know you talked a little bit about this. Do you want to go? I know you already laid out one expletive, but we learned a little.
You're making me say all the bad words.
Yeah, I'm just laying it all on you. I'm sorry, Ellen.
Well, I might not say this one because it's a bit more severe. But in the report, it does talk about when President Trump found out. It was May 2017. It was after he fired former FBI Director James Comey. And according to the report, when Trump found out a special counsel had been appointed, he said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed." So that sort of kind of sets the context for the fact that the president, throughout the investigation, railed against it, called it a witch hunt more than 100 times on Twitter, called it a hoax, would repeatedly attack it publicly. It's no surprise then, given what we know about how he felt about the investigation, that when he first found out, that's how, I guess, hard he took the news that he was being looked at.
Yeah, slumped in his chair in the Oval Office and apparently sort of blew a gasket right on this. You can also sort of read that statement as the president, I think, worrying about how he can execute the duties of his office, right, with this hanging over him. And that's kind of one of the arguments of why this Office of Legal Counsel memo says you can't indict a sitting president. The argument there is that, if the president has this burden of being under prosecution, it just makes it very difficult for him or her to do their job properly. See, sort of just flipping through some questions here.
Yeah, we have a question from Jacob Crawford on Facebook asking about evidence, saying that there
is evidence in the negative, lack of evidence, but how much of this is needed?
It's not that I think maybe lack of evidence is, it's that what was found didn't necessarily meet the bar for a criminal prosecution of a conspiracy.
Right. There is a Justice Department opinion that you don't prosecute unless you've reached a very high legal bar, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that happens to be a very high bar. So when we talk about insufficient evidence, that's what we're talking about, not being able to reach that high bar.
And that's a different bar than something that could be politically damaging. Whether or not something is something that can be prosecuted on a criminal charge, as Matt was saying, is a high bar. Whether something can cause a problem for someone politically is an easier standard or a lower bar to reach. So that's why we're seeing Democrats kind of really poring over this, examining what it says about the president's conduct. And one question has been in the last 24 hours is, could we see Democrats try to initiate impeachment proceedings based on what we now know of the president's conduct? From sort of top Democrats, they're kind of avoiding this question. They don't really seem to want to get into it too much.
It's a tricky one to get into.
It's a tricky one. The House Democratic Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, said that this is not what we should be doing. The American people will make up their minds at the ballot box in 2020. But you have that sort of more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, people like Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They are in favor of initiating some kind of impeachment, considering whether or not to go for impeachment. So that's going to be, we've seen a lot of fights within the Democratic Party recently, and that's going to be another one. But it will come down to the shrewd political calculation of, is this going to be good for us in 2020? And I think the calculus right now is that it probably won't be.
Right. I mean, even some of that is reflected in public opinion polling right now. There was a Monmouth University poll released just this week that showed most Americans, I think it was 54%, just want Congress to move on. They're kind of tired. We're hearing about Mueller fatigue, and that might actually speak to maybe how even effective, perhaps, Attorney General Barr's first out of the gate sort of framing of the Mueller report was, sort of being able to put a nice positive spin on this, maybe as favorable as possible interpretation of Mueller's report. Let that settle. We had 3 or 4 weeks in between that letter, right, and seeing the actual report, and in that time, opinions might have hardened on.
Exactly, and I think that's why Democrats were so angry about it, because if you are not, following the news religiously, if you're kind of dipping in and out, you see, the Attorney General said the Mueller report found no evidence of a crime. Okay, let's forget about this Russia thing. So I think that probably has been an effective way of going about this. There's a question now from Terrence Graham on YouTube. He praised Trump praised Mueller as a fair man the day the Barr memo came out. Why is Trump now condemning Mueller again?
Right.
You can go to Twitter for that.
Yeah. Right. You've got some tweets pulled up there.
Again, swear words, always swear words. But that's right. We did have. He's not, going after Mueller in the same way that we saw him before the report came out. But President Trump did post some tweets this morning. I will read them. He's obviously angry about some of these accounts, some of the more unflattering or embarrassing portrayals of him in the report. He wrote, "Statements are made about me by certain people in the crazy Mueller report, in itself written by 18 angry Democrat Trump haters, which are fabricated and totally untrue. Watch out for people that take so-called notes when the notes never existed until needed, because I never agreed to testify. It was not necessary for me to respond to statements made in the report about me, some of which are total, forgive me, bullshit, and only given to make the other person look good or me to look bad. This was an illegally started hoax that never should have happened." So perhaps I was wrong. That is a pretty strong attack on the Mueller report.
Yeah, and really, and I think, Terrence, you hit on something there, quite the contrast from the president's immediate reaction right after that first Barr, that 4-page letter came out on March 24th, which had sort of this more positive framing of the report. The president at the time said, he thought that Mueller acted honorably, I think was the word when a reporter asked him.
It was a pretty big change of tune from what we had seen of him previously. But there's a lot in this. I just want to kind of skim these tweets because there is a lot in here. And the president talks about testifying. We should mention that in his press conference yesterday, Attorney General William Barr talked about how cooperative President Trump and the White House had been during the investigation, that they allowed people to testify. They handed over all the documents. One person who didn't testify was President Trump himself. Instead, he provided written answers to a series of questions, working with his lawyer to do that. And those questions only related to the question of a conspiracy with Russia. The president did not answer any questions on the obstruction of justice front. That's a really interesting aspect of this.
It's basically a take-home test.
It is, with help from Rudy Giuliani. And Mueller talks in the report about why President Trump was not subpoenaed, and that's a question people have been asking, because to look at obstruction of justice, kind of the main thing you need to prove is corrupt intent. How do you prove that without having spoken to the person whose actions you're examining? That still, to me, is a confusing part of this. But Mueller, in the report, said the reason they didn't subpoena Trump was because it would have caused a substantial delay, and they thought they had the information that they needed, and it probably wouldn't have changed their calculation. But the president did not testify in the investigation.
Right. And another just great example of the stark contrast between how William Barr portrayed the cooperation of the White House and the president versus how the Mueller report sort of portrays that with those written questions. I believe the phrase "I do not recall" was used by the president more than 30 times. And it actually says in the Mueller report that they found the president's answers to be, quote, inadequate.
So we have a question from Mauro Ball on Facebook.
You can read this one again.
I'm not going to saying this, quoting the line that we talked about a few minutes ago. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed. And that again refers to, I'm just looking at some notes from our friend Steve D'Souza here. But that refers to the day that President Trump was informed that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had appointed a special counsel to investigate whether or not there were any ties, any working together between the Trump campaign and the White House. Now, that announcement happened at a pretty crazy time here in Washington. It was in the
May
same month.
2017,
Yeah, it was the same month that Trump fired former FBI Director James Comey, and I remember that day vividly getting the news alert, and it just kind of felt like all hell had broken loose, and there were a series of other news reports that happened, and then we had the appointment of the special counsel. One thing interesting is the day after he fired James Comey, President Trump had the Russian foreign minister and the former Russian ambassador in his office criticizing James Comey and calling him a real nut job. So that is another one of those the questioned sort of interactions with Russians by the Trump White House.
Why? Okay, so Scott Berry on Facebook asks, why was Mueller not at the press conference? And I think that's a really good question from Scott. I mean, we can sort of just read into it, right? But Mueller has so far not participated in any of the public statements or releases that Barr has been. So the press conference, Barr reportedly also offered to allow Mueller to preview his 4-page summary. Mueller also declined. So if we're sort of read into this, one way of interpreting that is Mueller simply didn't want to have anything to do with any sort of spin that he might not agree with. And I think that sort of thinking can also be applied to perhaps why he didn't show up at a press conference that was really meant to discuss his findings. I mean, you would think that if the guy worked on this for 23 months, that maybe he would have some questions to answer.
Yeah, and that was another criticism of the press conference that happened yesterday morning, was why wasn't Mueller there? And I think Barr was asked about that directly. Why isn't the main investigator here? It's his report. I forget the exact wording of the question, but Barr essentially said, no, it's my report. He did it for me as the Attorney General of the United States. So a bit defensive there. We obviously don't know Robert Mueller, but what we do know, what is widely reported of him, former FBI director himself, is that he is a by-the-books kind of guy. So he probably saw his role as to conduct this investigation, and then once it was conducted, it's sort of out of his hands, although it's not out of his hands entirely because the Democrats want him to testify about the investigation sometime in May on Capitol Hill. So we might actually hear from him. We're likely going to actually hear from him on all of this. Yeah,
it might take a few months, but one other thing I'll say about Mueller's style, because you mentioned, just his team so far has displayed really a lot of discipline, right? Over a 23-month investigation, no leaks really. The one time we did get leaks was fairly recently when we had a New York Times
and Washington Post
match the story, apparently through unnamed sources, but associates of the Mueller team, apparently very upset, unhappy with the way that Attorney General William Barr had portrayed their work.
Right, and in these stories, as Matt was saying, it was unnamed associates had spoken to the papers. They were unnamed associates of unnamed investigators on the team, so it was a bit of a third-person account. But in those stories, it said that those investigators, through these sources, found that the evidence that they gathered was both alarming and significant, and didn't feel like that had been conveyed in the letter from William Barr.
Right.
Another thing, actually, just to go back to what Matt was saying about how kind of locked up the Mueller team was when it came to leaks, there was a story a long time ago, probably the summer after the investigation actually first started, but where, I forget the exact kind of environment of it, but there was a story that they wouldn't even disclose what they ordered from Shake Shack.
Right.
That's how secretive these guys were. So when that report came out a few weeks ago, it was very noteworthy to us, the fact that after nearly 2 years of investigation, we're finally getting some kind of sentiment, albeit through this loose sourcing of how they actually felt, and perhaps reading what the report said yesterday is some kind of vindication of the disparity between the Barr letter and what was actually written by Mueller's team.
Right. It was really saying something, right, that we got this leak out of them. So one other thing maybe I can mention just about the special counsel and their work was that one thing that we learned recently was that they had actually released their own summaries. I believe there were 4 summaries that the special counsel had pre-prepared with their own either their own redactions, or it was carefully written, carefully drafted so that there would be minimal redactions. So one big question there was, why did William Barr kind of decide to go off on his own and release his own 4-page summary when in fact there were these already worked on documents that he could have simply just quickly sent out?
Yeah, that was one of the criticisms as well. We're getting a question.
Okay.
Rena, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Rena Boudreau on Facebook says, sadly, doesn't matter how much truth came out in this report, Trump supporters won't believe it. And I think that's probably very true.
That's probably a pretty insightful comment from Rena. Yeah, people they already have their minds made up. And in fact, over the entire course of this presidency, it's been very unusual how steady this president's favorability and approval ratings have been. I think they've consistently been between like 36 and 45% or the low 40s, somewhere around there. Not a lot of movement. So, you're right, Rena. You'd have to think a little bit about how much this is actually going to move the needle.
Exactly. And what's the famous quote from Trump, I think on the campaign trail, or maybe after he took office, where he said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I would still, I forget the end of it, but basically saying
still be elected, right?
Yeah, and he has the nickname Teflon Don for a reason, because these things, as Matt was saying, they don't really affect the level of support he has from his base, and that's perhaps why we see him cater to his base so much in the messaging that he puts out and things he tries to do, like on the border, for example. But the fact that this probably isn't going to change any minds vastly is probably why we're not going to see the Democrats do a whole lot about it. They will continue their investigations. They will make these calls for further testimony from Barr and from Mueller, but I think it's very unlikely that they're going to make the calculation that no matter how unflattering, embarrassing this report is, no matter if there is this gray area surrounding obstruction, it's going to come down to, is this going to benefit us politically? Is this going to earn us any voters? And I don't think that they're going to. I think they have been asked, senior Democrats have been asked in the last 24 hours, and they kind of shy away from the question. So it's all politics surrounding this.
And I think in the meantime, one thing we're going to be watching for is just the narrative jousting, right? Now that the report is out, what sort of spin is going to be put on this thing, and what's actually going to hold with people. We do know that Attorney General William Barr did give a sort of a preview of the report to the White House in advance, right? And that gave the president's attorneys sort of time to prepare their own point-by-point rebuttal, which we can expect soon, I think. It'll be a few dozen pages long.
Exactly.
Dozen pages long.
We're very tired. But exactly. And we have got a bit of that messaging already. Kellyanne Conway, senior advisor to President Trump, yesterday called the report, I think, a political proctology exam. So that is going to be the message we hear from the White House, but it is just going to sort of fall along. It's likely to fall along really partisan lines. And thinking back to the 2018 midterm elections, Democrats made a concerted effort not to run on against Trump. They tried to appeal to issues like healthcare, things that actually people can sort of feel in their wallets. And I think that they're going to kind of pursue that course going ahead to 2020 as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we kept hearing after the Barr summary came out was, remember, Democrats in 2018 did not run on collusion. Even if that narrative is out there, healthcare was actually by far the #1 issue in 2018.
Exactly. So that's kind of maybe perhaps a good way to wrap up. Looking ahead, just to remind everyone, Mueller report out yesterday did not establish that there was a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia to influence the 2016 election, but it did point out these instances of contacts between Russia and the Trump campaign. It did say that Russia thought President Trump would be good for them, and that the Trump campaign knew that Russian efforts could perhaps help them. And the question of obstruction of justice, it did not exonerate President Trump on that.
That was an excellent summary.
Thank you, Matt.
And I'll just add, I highly encourage anybody out there, this is a publicly viewable document online, justice.gov/SCO, SCO as in Special Counsel's Office. It'll be one of the top links there. You can download the full 448 pages yourself. Give it a read. Send us emails if there's something interesting that you think that we should be covering.
And read Matt's work on our website, CBCNews.ca. He has an analysis piece on the report. And thank you very much for writing us.
Yep, thank you.
Bye.